An orphaned grizzly cub, a loyal farm dog, and a bond no one ever expected. Raised side by side, they became brothers in a world that didn't understand them. Years later, after life had torn them apart, the bear returned, but he wasn't alone. What he brought changed everything. If you believe that love and loyalty can survive even the fiercest storms, this story will break your heart in the most beautiful way. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. This helps us share more powerful stories like this one. The rain had been falling for days, turning the dirt roads of northern Idaho into rivers of mud. It was the kind of storm that kept even the deer hidden and sent ranchers muttering curses under their breath. Ben Carter, 34, leaned on the wooden porch rail of his small cattle farm, watching the gray sky bleed into the hills. At his feet, his faithful border collie Max whimpered softly. Max never liked storms, maybe because he'd been born under one just like this. A shivering pup found clinging to life in a broken barn. That was 3 years ago. Now Max was Ben's only real companion out here. There wasn't much room for other people, just miles of fence lines, stubborn cattle, and memories Ben tried hard to outrun. It was Max who heard it first, a thin, desperate cry threading through the sound of the storm. He bolted from the porch, barking sharply. Ben cursed and grabbed his coat, following him across the muddy yard toward the tree line. There, tangled in the thorny underbrush, was a sight that made Ben's heart seize, a tiny grizzly cub, soaked to the bone, eyes wide with terror. His small frame shivered so violently that the branches rattled around him. No mother in sight, no tracks leading away. Ben didn't hesitate. He scooped the cub up carefully, ignoring the sharp thorns that tore at his hands. The cub was light, too light, just a sack of fur and trembling bones. Max sniffed at the cub anxiously, whining again, tail tucked between his legs. Back at the house, Ben wrapped the cub in an old quilt and stoked the fire until the cabin glowed with warmth. The cub barely moved, only his eyes followed Ben's every step. He should call fish and game, Ben thought grimly. He knew that, but something inside him, something raw and broken, couldn't let go of this little creature just yet. Maybe it was because he saw too much of himself in that cub, lost, alone, caught in a world that didn't know what to do with him. Max seemed to understand. He curled up next to the bundle of fur, pressing his warm body against the cub's side. The little bear let out a tiny, rasping sigh and closed his eyes. Ben sat down heavily in his old armchair, staring into the fire. "You're going to be a handful," he muttered. "Guess we'll figure it out together." He didn't know then what he was starting. He didn't know that this little cub, who he'd name Boone, would grow up alongside Max, thinking he was just another dog. And he couldn't possibly imagine the day, years later, when Boone would come back, bringing a gift that would tear open every scar Ben thought had healed. But for now, there was only the rain, the fire, and the fragile beginnings of a family stitched together by nothing more than need and a little bit of hope. The days after the storm settled into a strange kind of rhythm. Boone, the little grizzly cub, adapted to life on Ben's farm with a clumsy eagerness that left both man and dog constantly surprised. At first, Boone could barely stand without swaying. Max treated him like an awkward puppy, nudging him upright when he toppled over, growling playfully when the bear swatted too hard with his oversized paws. Boone learned quickly. Within a week, he followed Max everywhere, limping after him across muddy pastures, poking his nose into the feed bins, collapsing in the loft when his tiny legs gave out. Ben watched it all with a tightness in his chest he hadn't felt in years. He set up a makeshift bed for Boone in the corner of the barn near Max's sleeping spot. At night, Boone would curl against Max's warm body, tiny snores filling the silent barn like a lullaby. Sometimes, when Ben couldn't sleep, he'd sit in the barn doorway, coffee growing cold in his hands, watching them breathe in sync under the moonlight. The rules said Boone didn't belong here. The world would call him dangerous, unpredictable, a liability. But when Ben looked into those dark, earnest eyes, so full of trust, it almost hurt to meet them. He didn't see a future threat. He saw a family. Of course, Boone wasn't a normal puppy. By the end of the second month, he was double Max's size. He still tumbled after sticks Max chased, still wrestled in the dirt until they were both a mess of fur and mud. But Boone's strength was becoming undeniable. A single joyful swipe could send Max rolling across the yard. Ben knew he couldn't hide Boone forever. Already, neighbors were beginning to notice the strange dog at the edge of the woods. He needed a plan. One chilly morning, Ben hitched up his truck and drove Boone and Max out into the dense foothills behind his land, miles of unclaimed territory thick with rivers and old-growth forest. "If you're going to survive, you've got to learn to be what you are," Ben told Boone, crouching beside him. The bear blinked up at him, cocking his head the way Max did when he didn't understand. Ben's throat tightened. He pointed toward the woods. "That's your home someday, not this farm, not me." Max whined, pawing at Boone's side. Ben stayed out there for hours, throwing fish into the stream for Boone to catch, letting him explore under careful watch. Boone was clumsy, but instinct stirred beneath his playful swipes. Maybe there was hope. Maybe, given time, Boone could survive out there on his own. Still, when they loaded back into the truck that night, Boone pressed his massive head against Ben's shoulder, letting out a low, contented rumble. And Ben realized with a sharp twist of pain that Boone didn't want to be wild, not yet, maybe not ever. He wanted to be with them, with Max, with Ben, in the only pack he had ever known. As winter crept closer and Boone grew heavier, Ben knew the clock was ticking. He had built a life on isolation, on not needing anyone. Now, there were two beating hearts that needed him, and he needed them too, whether he admitted it or not. But how long could this fragile, stolen happiness last? And what would it cost when the world inevitably came knocking? By the time Boone reached his first winter on the farm, he was no longer a tiny, clumsy cub. He was a yearling, strong and thick-furred, standing nearly shoulder-high to Ben when he reared up on his hind legs. And although in Boone's mind, he was still just one of the dogs, the outside world had started to notice. It began innocently enough. Ben had taken Max into town for supplies, leaving Boone behind in the barn as usual. But when a passing hunter saw the giant dog lumbering near the fence line, word spread fast. First, it was a whisper at the gas station. Then a rumor over coffee at the diner. "You hear about Carter's place? Swear to God, he's got a bear living with his collie. Guy's always been a little touched, but a bear? That's suicide." Ben felt the walls closing in. He made excuses to stay home, stopped taking Max into town, and started keeping Boone locked inside whenever strangers came too close. But Boone wasn't a secret that could be hidden forever. One afternoon, Ben found a notice nailed to his fence, state wildlife officials to inspect premises, 10 days notice. Ben tore it down with shaking hands. Inside the house, Boone and Max wrestled on the worn living room rug, oblivious. Boone let out a happy rumble when he saw Ben, trotting over and nudging him with his massive head like a child asking for attention. Ben sank to the floor, burying his face in Boone's thick fur. His throat burned. He had known deep down that this day would come. You couldn't keep a grizzly as a pet. You couldn't freeze time. Still, knowing it didn't make it hurt any less. Boone wasn't a project, he wasn't a problem to fix. He was family. He was Ben's second chance, the one good thing life had given him after taking so much. That night, sitting by the fire, Ben made a decision. He would teach Boone to live free, not just visits to the woods, not just fishing trips, real survival, real independence. It had to be that way. Boone deserved to live wild, to be what he was born to be, even if it broke Ben's heart into pieces. The next morning, Ben packed the old truck with camping gear, enough supplies for 2 weeks. Max leapt excitedly into the front seat, and Boone squeezed into the truck bed with a confused grunt. "We're going on an adventure, buddy," Ben said, forcing a smile. "Time to show you the real world." As the sun rose behind them, casting golden light over the hills, Ben drove toward the deep heart of the forest, to places so wild that even maps gave up trying to name them. He didn't know if Boone would understand. He didn't know if he was strong enough to let go, but he had 10 days to teach the bear he loved more than life itself how to survive without him. And somewhere deep inside, he knew this wasn't just Boone's test, it was his too. The first few days in the wilderness were harder than Ben expected, and far harder than Boone could understand. Ben had chosen a stretch of protected land, far from any town, where rivers braided through towering pines and ancient cliffs carved the sky, a place big enough to lose a bear if that bear was ready to be lost. They set up camp by a cold, clear stream. Boone and Max explored together, with Boone bounding ahead like an oversized puppy, snapping at snowflakes and clumsily chasing after rabbits he never caught. But survival wasn't a game. Ben had a plan. He would teach Boone to fish, forage, and fend for himself. The first fishing lesson was a disaster. Boone splashed into the stream with excitement, scattering the fish before he even realized what he was supposed to do. Max barked at him from the bank as if scolding a reckless little brother. Ben laughed despite himself. "Patience, Boone," he said softly. "The good things are worth waiting for." On the third day, Boone managed to snag a trout between his teeth, looking bewildered but proud when he dropped it at Max's feet. Ben knelt beside him, ruffling the thick fur between his ears. "That's it, buddy, you're getting it." But every small victory stabbed at Ben's heart. Each moment Boone grew more independent was a reminder of what had to come, the moment when he would have to stay out here, and Ben would drive away without him. At night, Boone curled close to the fire with Max tucked against his side. Sometimes Boone would lift his head and stare at the dark woods beyond their camp, as if sensing something pulling at him. Ben watched him from the shadows, feeling the tightening in his chest with every passing hour. It wasn't just Boone changing. Ben could feel it inside himself too, a crack widening into a chasm he didn't know how to cross. He wasn't ready. He had spent so long learning how to be alone again. Letting someone, even a bear, into his broken heart had been a risk he hadn't meant to take, and now the thought of losing Boone felt almost unbearable. On the 6th night, as snow began to fall in slow, heavy flakes, Boone didn't settle by the fire. Instead, he paced the edge of the woods, sniffing the cold air, grumbling low in his chest. Ben sat very still, not calling him back, not making a sound. He knew what it meant. Boone was starting to feel it, the call of the wild that no human love could silence. When Boone finally returned to camp, he didn't climb into Ben's lap like he used to as a cub. He laid down a few feet away, watching the dark with restless, gleaming eyes. Ben stared into the fire, feeling the burn of unshed tears. "You're getting ready," he whispered. "You're going to be okay." The words tasted like ash. He had 9 more days before the officials came looking. 9 days to teach Boone. 9 days to find a way to say goodbye, and somehow Ben realized, 9 days to find a way to survive losing him without losing himself again. The sun rose pale and cold on the 8th day. Ben sat by the dead embers of the fire, sipping bitter coffee, watching Boone patrol the edge of the woods like a restless spirit. Max lay at Ben's feet, head on his paws, eyes tracking Boone's every move. There was a weight in the air that morning, a tension neither man nor dog could shake off. Ben stood slowly, brushing the frost from his jacket. "Come on, boys," he called. "Time to find breakfast." Boone lifted his massive head, huffed, and loped toward the trees with an eagerness that almost looked impatient. Max barked once, then took off after him. Ben followed, boots crunching over frozen leaves, heart uneasy. They spent the morning along the river where the fish ran thick and silver. Boone waded in deep, his strength and instincts now sharp and sure. He hauled out 2 trout in less than an hour, tossing one toward Max as if sharing spoils with his brother. Ben laughed, pride swelling in his chest. "You're a natural," he called. But Boone didn't look back. Instead, after a quick shake of his thick fur, he bounded up the opposite bank and disappeared into the tree line, moving faster than Ben had ever seen. "Boone!" Ben shouted, but there was no response. Max barked frantically, circling where Boone had vanished. Ben dropped the fish and sprinted after him, heart slamming against his ribs. Branches tore at his face, mud sucked at his boots. He ran until his lungs burned, calling Boone's name over and over. Silence answered him. He searched until nightfall. Max howled under the moon, a long, mournful sound that twisted Ben's gut into knots, but Boone was gone. Ben slumped against a fallen tree, staring blindly into the dark woods. Maybe Boone had finally felt the pull of the wild too strongly to resist. Maybe he had found his true place, as Ben had always hoped. But the way Boone had disappeared, without a glance, without a goodbye, left Ben hollowed out inside, as if someone had scooped the heart clean from his chest. The next morning, Ben packed up camp with numb hands. Max sat by the truck, tail drooping, eyes fixed on the trees. Ben knelt beside him, resting a hand on the dog's head. "He's where he's supposed to be," Ben said, his voice cracking. "We did good, boy. We did what we had to do." Max whined low in his throat but didn't move. Neither did Ben. Not for a long time. He waited there at the edge of the forest, long after the sun rose and the frost melted, waiting for a sign, waiting for a miracle. He didn't believe in none, came finally with a heaviness that seemed to anchor his bones. Ben climbed into the truck, Max hopping in beside him. The road home blurred in Ben's vision. The farm was just as they had left it, fences sagging, fields silent, the porch light flickering weakly against the early winter dark. Ben unloaded the truck in silence. Max refused to leave the front step, staring down the long driveway as if expecting Boone to come barreling out of the night. But days passed, then a week, then 2, no sign of Boone. Ben tried to tell himself he should be happy. Boone had made it, Boone had found the life he was meant for. But every evening, as the sun bled out over the empty fields, Ben felt the ache settle deeper into his bones. A familiar kind of ache, the kind that came from losing someone you loved without getting the chance to say goodbye. He had set Boone free, and in doing so, he had broken his own heart all over again. It was the first heavy snow of the season. Ben was chopping wood behind the barn, breath misting in the freezing air, when Max suddenly bolted from the porch, barking like he hadn't in weeks. Ben dropped the axe immediately, his heart kicking painfully against his ribs. Max raced toward the far end of the property, toward the woods. Ben followed, boots slipping in the new snow, vision blurring from the cold and the sudden desperate surge of hope. At the edge of the clearing, Max stopped, tail wagging furiously, and standing there just beyond the fence line, framed by falling snow, was Boone, bigger, wilder, his fur thick and shaggy, his shoulders broader than Ben had ever imagined. He looked every inch the wild grizzly now, strong, untamed, magnificent. But his eyes, those deep, dark eyes, they were the same. They were Boone's. Ben took a shaky step forward. "Boone." The great bear huffed, dipping his head low in a gesture so familiar it made Ben's throat tighten painfully. Boone rumbled softly, a sound halfway between a purr and a growl, and then, incredibly, he nudged something forward with his massive paw. Ben squinted, something small, shivering against the snow, 2 tiny cubs. 2. Ben staggered closer, disbelief making his steps clumsy. Boone stayed still, watching him with a calm, steady gaze. The cubs, smaller than Boone had been when Ben first found him, whimpered softly. Their fur was matted with snow, their bellies hollow with hunger. Max whined, inching forward carefully. Boone grunted low and gave a slight nod, a permission, as if saying, "They're yours now." Ben dropped to his knees in the snow, arms open, heart hammering. The little cubs hesitated, then toddled toward him, collapsing against his chest, seeking warmth. Tears burned in Ben's eyes. He looked up at Boone, choking on emotion. "You brought them here," Ben whispered. "You trusted me." Boone rumbled again, softer this time, almost tender. Ben understood. Boone had found his own life out there in the wild. He had become what Ben always hoped he would become. But when he needed someone he could trust with what mattered most, his own family, he came home. Ben buried his face in the cub's fur, letting the tears fall freely now, hot against his frozen cheeks. When he looked up again, Boone was backing away slowly toward the trees. Max barked once, a sharp, almost pleading sound. Boone paused, gave one last long look at the man and dog who had raised him, then turned and disappeared into the snow-shrouded woods without a sound. This time, Ben didn't call him back. He watched Boone's massive form fade into the white, feeling something in his chest crack open, not from pain, but from awe, from pride, from love so deep it hurt. He cradled the 2 trembling cubs tighter against him, whispering promises he wasn't sure how he'd keep yet, but he would. He had to, because Boone had trusted him with something far more precious than himself. He had trusted him with his legacy. Winter that year was brutal. The snows piled high against the barn doors, the wind howled through the trees like a chorus of ghosts. But inside the old farmhouse, there was life, messy, loud, and full of hope. The 2 cubs, who Ben had named Willow and Ash, grew stronger by the day. Willow, the smaller of the 2, was fearless, always climbing onto tables, knocking over feed buckets, tumbling headfirst into snowdrifts with a wild gleam in her eyes. Ash was quieter, more thoughtful, never far from Max's side, watching and learning. Ben built a bigger shelter beside the barn, reinforced with timber and lined with straw, a space big enough for the cubs to grow into, at least for now. The ranch wasn't just a place for cattle anymore, it was a sanctuary. Every morning, Ben rose before the sun, fixing bottles for the cubs, checking fences, teaching Willow and Ash to forage in the frozen woods. Max helped in his way, too, herding the cubs back when they wandered too far, barking when they tried to sneak into the feed room. It was chaos. It was exhausting. It was life, raw and wild and beautiful. And every night, as Ben sat on the porch, Max asleep at his feet and the cubs snoring softly in the shelter, he would look out toward the distant tree-line, always wondering, always hoping. Sometimes, just before dawn, he swore he saw a shadow move between the pines, massive and silent and watching. He never called out. He didn't need to. He knew it was Boone, checking on them, protecting them still, part of their family, even from afar. The notice from Wildlife Services eventually came and went. Ben had prepared for a fight, ready to lie, to hide, to do whatever it took to protect Willow and Ash. But the inspection was brief. Maybe the heavy snows helped. Maybe the world just turned a blind eye to a stubborn man and his unusual family. Either way, the cubs stayed. As spring thawed the fields and rivers sang with meltwater, Ben found himself changing, too. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living, loving. He thought often of Boone, out there carving a life in the mountains, strong, wild, free, and he understood now that real love wasn't about holding on. It was about trusting someone enough to let them go and still believing they'd find their way back when it mattered most. One evening, as the sunset poured molten gold across the fields, Willow clambered up onto the porch and dropped a clump of wildflowers at Ben's feet, her tongue lolling in a proud, goofy grin. Ben laughed, a real laugh, rich and full, and scooped her up, burying his face in her soft fur. "You're going to drive me crazy," he said, voice thick with affection, "but you're exactly where you're meant to be." And so was he. The scars on his heart hadn't disappeared, but they had new stories now, stories of second chances, of impossible bonds, of the wild, stubborn, magnificent love that had found him when he needed it most, all because once upon a time, a lonely man had taken a chance on a lost little bear. And that little bear had never forgotten. If this story touched your heart, remember, sometimes the bonds we build are stronger than anything nature or time can tear apart. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share this video with someone who believes in second chances, just like Boone did. Together, let's spread more stories of hope, love, and the wild connections that change our lives forever.